and welcome to Ye Olde Bestsellers Book Club, where I am reading through some of America's earliest best-selling novels, as reported by The Bookman, a literary magazine of the 1890s. Today's book is Number 5 John Street by Richard Whiting, published 1899. He was 59 at that point, and while he had been writing and had published before, this was the first work to really make him known. Now, when first writing this script, I encountered a bit of a problem because I was half convinced that our protagonist didn't have a name. Everything's written in first person, so that didn't help, and by my count, his name appears less than 10 times in the whole book, spelled 3 different ways, none of which are correct. On my rereading, it's a lot more obvious that he did get called by name a few times. On my first read-through, I got a little lost in the dialogue. Sometimes I wasn't always sure who was talking to who or about what. Anyway, his name is Charles. I assume. The word Charles doesn't actually appear anywhere in the text, but Charles does with a W, as does Charlie, also W. There's a lot of thick accents in this one. Charlie, with a Y at the end, which I find offensive, appears once. I did not spell it that way in the script, bite me. So, now that I know what to call him, we can begin. Quote, Number 5 John Street is a 4-storied hovel in the very heart of a slum, which lies between 2 of the finest thoroughfares of the West End. I have come here, in this year of Diamond Jubilee, to learn what it is to live on half a crown a day and to earn it, end quote. Charlie is a rich, fancy-pants sort of man. His only job, as far as I can tell, is being invited to dinner parties. Now, this book is not quite a sequel, but it is a successor to a book that the author published a decade or so earlier called The Island and Adventure of a Person of Quality. And Charlie has a friend, Lord Name Redacted, who I assume is the protagonist of The Island, name withheld for his fictional privacy. See, Mr. Redacted got himself stranded on a tiny, remote island inhabited by people with very limited exposure to the world beyond the sea. They are under the jurisdiction of the Crown, and from what they've been told by passers-by, believe that England is practically utopia. Wealthy, luxurious, the epitome of good morals. Lord Redacted eventually gets back to London, inspired by, quote, their simplicity, their innocence, and their belief that the search after goodness was the true business of life, end quote. He now has these great ideals of improving English society, and then he almost immediately dies. Up until this point, I think we've just been summarizing the events of The Island. I don't know if that book ends before or after his death. If it's after, that's funny in its own way. But if it's before, imagine you read that book, followed this man on his great journey of growth. He ends the novel hopeful for a better future. Then you crack open the sort of sequel 10 years later, and your beloved Lord Redacted is dead on page 3. Charlie, as a dear friend of Lord Redacted, is given the responsibility of going through all of his old documents and letters and things, and he finds one letter from the governor of that little island. The Diamond Jubilee is coming up in a few months to celebrate 60 years of Queen Victoria's reign, and the islanders heard about this celebration from a passing ship, and they wrote to ask Lord Redacted to be their agent general, a representative for them in this celebration to show their gratitude and patriotic joy toward the crown. Charlie writes back and offers to take Lord Redacted's place as Agent General, which the governor gratefully agrees to, and also asks him to, quote, report on the laws, customs, institutions, and manners of the mother country for the edification of the islanders, end quote. Charlie takes this responsibility very seriously, but quickly hits a wall, because surely he should report on all facets of English life, but he is a fancy-pants rich boy with no knowledge of what he calls the other half, which is when he develops his plan to, quote, for a certain time of probation, get my own living with my own hands. No matter what the hardship or what the temptation, I would make my own earnings serve, end quote. He tells all of his rich friends that he's gone traveling and gets a job as a factory clerk that pays 18 shillings a week, 9/10 of a pound, which by the Bank of England's inflation calculator today would be around just under 100 modern pounds a week. If he worked a whole year at this rate, it'd be just under 5,000 modern pounds, just over $6,000 a year. At the factory, he meets a man whose name is either Cove or Cove. I'm going to go with Cove. Covey to his friends, Low Covey to the girl who lives downstairs, quote, when she's wild, end quote. Covey seems somewhat friendly and potentially helpful to keep around, and it is he who suggests that Charlie look for lodgings at number 5 on John Street, where he himself lives. Charlie's rent there is 2.5 shillings a week, which is about 14% of his total wages, so that part's not too bad. Now, Charlie says himself that Covey's speech is so aggressively Cockney that its sound cannot be properly transcribed by our humble alphabet. It cannot be written phonetically. And I was given hope that that meant he wouldn't try to transcribe it phonetically. How hopelessly optimistic. Covey's U is universally Y-E-R. Awkward starts with an O and has 2 Ks but no Ws. He's also quite partial to slang. That one I can excuse, even if it means I don't understand at all what's going on. When, in discussing where Charlie should live, Covey asks if he has any sticks, and Charlie says no, but he means to buy some. My best guesses are furniture or guns. And as far as I know, he never buys any guns. So we get a rundown of Charlie's new day-to-day life, how he budgets his week, what a day at the factory looks like, how he wakes up for work on time. There's a guy in the building that you can pay to knock on your door in the morning. Charlie does have some trouble fitting in with the John Street way of life. Covey thinks it's ridiculous that he insists on paying an older lady downstairs to wash his clothes and tidy his room, which, by the way, costs the exact same as his entire rent. Charlie thinks it's repulsive that Covey is willing to eat block ornaments, which are, quote, absolutely indefinable remnants of meat offered in a miscellaneous heap at the common butcher's shops, end quote. He does work out a functional budget, but realizes it leaves nothing left over for saving, which isn't relevant to him. He's only here for 6 weeks. But he finds it very distressing that if this were his life, he'd have no room for long-term investments, like clothing, or a sick fund, or a retirement fund. Covey's advice is don't worry about it, it'll all work out. You just have to not live too long. Make merry, die young. One night, in his room, Charlie is musing about how this kind of gross, dilapidated building is in some ways, quote, even as beautiful as a sudden tumult in the backyard, a shriek of murder, end quote. This sends the whole house into a flurry of motion, except for an unbothered few. Charlie follows the crowd outside to the yard to find 4 people in a standoff. A young woman with raised fists, a boy cowering at her feet, a drunken bleeding sailor who is threateningly caressing a knife, and the screamer, a woman, quote, whose whole person has an indescribable air of steamy dampness and melting away. She is as indeterminate in outline as an ill-made pudding. She still cries, murder! 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 With an automatic regularity suggestive of some new variety of bank holiday machine, end quote. That's the strangest character description I have ever read. There has not, in fact, even been a murder. The moist-looking woman had been walking with the sailor, and he tripped on the boy, who had been sleeping on a stairway. This pissed the sailor off, so he kicked the kid. The woman objected, and so he smacked her, then dragged the child into the yard for more beating. Enter the young woman, who punched him in the face, cue screaming, and everyone coming outside. Covey finally bothers to come see what all the fuss was about, recognizes the young woman as a pal, and takes the sailor out in one unexpected punch. We now veer into lots of descriptions about Charlie's various new neighbors around John Street, and how smelly some of them are. Among the not explicitly pungent are Holy Joe, we've got Old 48 and his foreign friend, Mr. Israel, who is, as Covey puts it, quote, one of these 'ere anarchists, suthin' about blowin' people inside out, I've heerd say. Commune, if you know what that means. I don't, end quote. I'm not going to attempt a Cockney accent, but I am going to read the words as they are written, and I'm sorry. Azrael gives a lot of purely hypothetical lectures about how one could theoretically create explosions, not that you would need to, or anything. The young woman with the solid punch is Tilda. She sells flowers for a living, and apparently this is not the first time Covey has seen her trying to knock someone's teeth in. One of her friends and admirers in the building is a much daintier young woman named Nance, who's a factory worker with a startlingly narrow, insect-like waist that Charlie thinks defies biology. Charlie thinks about Tilda's appearance, quote, "If the face were before me on a canvas to shape as I liked, I should take just a thought from the prominence of the cheekbones, and perhaps reduce the fullness of the lips," end quote. Her nose he would leave alone, even though he states it isn't perfect. He also thinks she looks a bit Japanese, quote, "No uncommon thing in this rank, yet it is Japanese only in the woman's way," end quote. I don't know what that means. Also, you're being creepy, Charlie. Please stop mentally photoshopping this woman. Covey gives Charlie a proper introduction to Tilda some days after the yard incident, and Charlie is painfully awkward because he only knows how to talk to rich people. And Covey, I guess. But they get through it. Tilda says ta-ta, quote, "Yet she lingers, and it is now her turn to look embarrassed." "Please, mammy, I'm shy," says Covey by way of explanation, and sticking his finger in his mouth in grotesque mimicry of the air of a blushing child. "I'm very uncomfortable." "She wants her to show up at a sort of bun struggle in her room," he explains, "and she don't know how to get it out." "A sort of what?" "Well, kind of a tea fight," he returns, for his only conception of plain English is never anything more than a second dilution of slang. End quote. The translation is that Charlie has been invited to tea next Sunday, and he gladly accepts. Why is that a bun struggle? Covey continues making me uncomfortable as they chat about Tilda after this, how she dresses nice and bathes regularly because it helps her sell more flowers. Quote, "Scented soap, too, Sundays. Num, num, num." End quote. Ah! Covey is still num-num-numbing when he and Charlie go to the tea party, this time over the lavender-scented perfume wafting off of Tilda's handkerchief. He is doing this in front of Tilda. It otherwise sounds like a lovely little gathering. Nance sings a dirge, there's little heart-shaped cakes, Covey does some spectacular bird impressions, Charlie is distracted through the whole thing by grumpy old men arguing politics outside the open window. Now, Charlie gets through 4 of the 6 weeks planned for this experiment, and then he gets fired. So now he has 2 weeks left to live with less than £1 in his pocket and no job. Covey also got fired, but Charlie is way more stressed out about that than he is. Covey just assumes it'll all work out, always has, and tells Charlie to, quote, "Keep your pecker up." I'm gonna hope that means chin. Charlie works out a strict budget to avoid starving, living off of bread, sugarless cocoa, and water, with a smidge of money left over. He then spends 6 days thinking he is definitely about to land a new job, buying a fancy meal to celebrate, not getting the job, oopsies, I blew my budget. This leads him to the revelation about, quote, "the lie that the best way to make a man work is to let him starve. The shorter my commons, the longer my loafing rests. My chief concern is how to glide through the day with the smallest possible expenditure of toil, either of body or of mind. It is easier, on the whole, to go hungry and dirty than to fret." End quote. He lives on his horrible cocoa bread and the knowledge that soon he gets to go home, finding comfort in all of the letters and invitations he's being forwarded by his trusty manservant Stubbs. On the final night, he gets a final meal from a shelter where he is faced with the sight of the truly destitute. The people who carry all they own wrapped in the same cloth scraps that make up their meager clothes, who come here to sleep on a mattress they place in a bottomless wooden box on the floor, like rows and rows of bodies in coffins. Quote, "The sight finished me, and without waiting for the stroke of midnight, as I should do, I fairly turned tail. I rush back to number 5 and leave a line for the landlord. Got a job in the country, keep an eye on my room. Then I run straight home to Piccadilly, let myself in, bathe, feed, and sink into dreamless sleep until I open my eyes the next morning, on dear old Stubbs drawing the curtains and laying the cup of tea by the bedside." End quote. Charlie is swept up immediately into ceaseless dances, parties, and dinners. Quote, "I am on the move again among soft-spoken, sweet-smelling people, and I have recovered my sense of the fitness of things. It is pleasant to know a spade for a spade, and not to have to use it for a teaspoon." End quote. This man swings so quickly and so wholeheartedly from one position to another. A couple days in at John Street, and he thought minimalism was the true way to know oneself. High-end furniture makers should learn from the simple poor man's stool. He started dreaming of how he could reduce his possessions even further, until it was no more than he could travel with. Then he gets home, immediately buys a painting worth £400, and suddenly opulence is the way again. Later in the book, he visits an idyllic village in the country, and it takes 5 minutes before he proclaims that truly, the calm life of the villager is the natural state of man. The hectic city dweller is just a, quote, monster of the species, end quote. Wherever Charlie happens to stand still for a few seconds is truly the only natural and correct state of humanity. This part of the book spends a lot of time exploring the wealthy people's idea that being a socialite is labor. One man at a garden party says, quote, "I tell you, it's just like working in a mosaic. So many little bits to fit in. I don't think our set ever get a chance in life. Always slaving. That's it. And yet we are called the idle rich. Idle rich. I work 10 hours a day inventing wants for myself and work for them, being the poor," end quote. At a dinner party, they talk about another man who, quote, "owns 3 towns, and I don't know how many square miles of country. No sparrow may fall in any of them without his knowing it. A dog's life. Why can't he make them own themselves? What right have they to spoil a man's rest? It's the penalty of having to set an example," end quote. Charlie can at least tell now that his feelings have drifted some from the people around him. He's much more aware of and grateful for the luxuries he has, and he's able to consider that maybe the poor don't enjoy being poor. I mean, it seemed like he'd learned some lessons. Then he sits down to work on his report to the governor and decides that the problem with John Street is that they suffer from the, quote, crime of contentment. They voluntarily, or at any rate with resignation, live as nobody ought to live, end quote. He seems to be working around to a point about how everyone is doing without in some way, physically or spiritually, from John Street to the most elegant suburbs, but he cuts himself off before explaining that because this is all just way too critical of England. The islanders would never be able to accept this kind of report, not with their idea of how England is. He needs to ease them into this sort of thing. So he rewrites, and in this version claims that, sure, there is, quote, a limited number of the humbler sort, whose circumstances are not all that could be desired, end quote, but that this is just a, quote, passing inconvenience, end quote, because of all the people crowding into the city for the Jubilee. Sure, occasionally someone starves to death, but that's rare, quote, and in all such cases there is reason to believe the unhappy sufferers are only those who have steadily refused to work, end quote. This is exactly the opposite of the lesson you just spent 2 weeks learning, as you tried desperately to find work but couldn't, and were left languishing in hunger and discomfort. It is so completely the opposite that has to be the point, and the joke, surely, but Charlie doesn't seem stupid all the time, so it's still kind of baffling when he is. Around this time, he becomes casual friends with Seton Riddler, a very wealthy and incredibly well-dressed young man who is just rabid for fashion. He pops by his tailor's several times a week to micromanage the constant stream of new garments he has made, and he lives in not 1, but 2 suites in a local fancy pants hotel. Just one wouldn't have enough room for all of his full wardrobe and color-coordinated matching accessories. Also, all of his laundry is sent all the way down to the south of France for washing because the English working class are just too careless to do it right. Charlie has a lovely day out with Seton. They get lunch, go to a polo match, and on the ride home, Seton gets surprisingly philosophical. And from this conversation, Charlie compiles a paragraph on Seton's working theory of life for the Island Report. It is, in fact, 10 paragraphs, if we're counting each line break as a new one. Some are short, but still, don't give me hope like that, Charlie. Seton's perspective is that, quote, the grand rich are not only a foundation of things, they are as the sun in nature. They give light and heat to the whole frame. If they were withdrawn, we should all suddenly freeze to death in the dark. As for the common run of people, the sordidness of their lives is no doubt distressing in the extreme from an elevated point of view, but such as their lot is, it is the utmost of dignity, beauty, comfort, and ease that can possibly be spared to them. If they insist on more, they may imperil the existence of the rich. Besides, they are used to their privations, and even enjoy them, in a way." End quote. Not long after this, Charlie flees back to John Street, though he isn't quite sure why this time. Quote, "The one thing beyond conjecture is that here I am, and that I mean to stay as long as the fun lasts, and then go back to live happy ever after as a civilized man." End quote. He gets a new job as a gate clerk at the same rubber factory where Nance works, and goes back to his restriction of only spending money he actually earns. We get to learn more about Covey. When Charlie first met him, he had a factory job, but proper salaried employment is a rarity for him. He prefers work, quote, "wherein the day provides for the day, and the day's work varies from the holding of horses or the running of messages to the tripping up of a drunken navy at large and rendering him destitute of the means of further riot by a swift visitation of his pockets," end quote. Though, while he may be a criminal, he's got a soft spot for the weak and, quote, "would not hurt a worm," end quote. Tilda is starting to get suspicious about Charlie. She can tell that he must have had more money at some point in his life, but assumes he ended up at John Street through a misfortune of either love or liquor. He's super flattered that she thinks that, because it means she's been thinking about him at all. Also, apparently her relationship with Covey dances on the line of flirtation. Charlie just straight up stalks them one afternoon when they go out together. Quote, "Tilda was in her second best, Covey was smartened up. They did not walk together, the swain kept some few yards in advance. It preserves the sense of independence, and tends to confirm the promenade in its character of a non-committal stroll. To walk side by side might imply a settled thing. When they felt the need of closer communication, it found its satisfaction in horseplay. The damsel now and again stole up to him on tiptoe, struck him coquettishly with her fist, and then ran away. He gave chase, overtook her, and thumped her with judgment and discernment, to the accompaniment of her shrieks of defiance and alarm." End quote. I really don't know what to say about that, besides that this is the most aggressively heterosexual flirting I have heard of in my entire life. Now, so far, Charlie has always seemed super admiring of Tilda. She's fierce and defiant. She's an Amazon on a warpath. She's emblematic of the, quote, "glorious survival of a time when woman struck for rights with her fist," end quote. And he's always seemed to like how she's not like other girls, at least the girls he knows. They're kind of snobbish, very proper, a bit holier than thou, pieces of polished high-class perfection. But Tilda doesn't put on a show or wear a mask. She is always truly herself. But Charlie now embarks on a quest to change her. It starts as pretty innocent. He thinks she needs more exposure to intellectual hobbies, so he starts taking her out to art galleries and music halls, but she doesn't quite get the point of any of it. She tries for his sake, and she clearly feels guilty and shameful about not appreciating it more, which Charlie finds touching and charming. I find it sad. She's legitimately upset, and he is way too happy about it. Introducing her to books goes over a little better. He has her read The Arabian Nights, and she likes that, but something about the scenes of luxurious splendor and beautiful, tempting slave women prompt her to say that, quote, "she supposed there was something wrong with her, but she would try to be a better girl," end quote, which is ick. The Jubilee finally actually comes around, and Charlie goes with Covey, Tilda, and Nance to watch the procession. The rich and powerful have pre-assigned seats lining the road, and looking at them, Charlie thinks to himself, quote, "Persons I had hitherto thought blameless looked perfect plutocrats, not to say bloodsuckers, as they now affront my poverty from their numbered seats," end quote. Sir, you don't have any poverty. This is a thing that he has been doing since like 2 days after moving into John Street for the first time. He has no hesitation to say we when referring to the experiences of the impoverished, as though he is actually one of them, and he does it constantly. Now, for all the constant build-up about the Jubilee since the beginning of the book, nothing really happens during it except a lot more of Charlie's #deep thoughts and a charity dinner for the poor. Now, Nance has been getting noticeably weak lately. It's been coming up in the background of a lot of other scenes. Finally, it's bad enough to warrant a visit from a doctor who says that he has seen cases like hers 1,000 times over. It's from constantly inhaling fumes in her work at the rubber plant. And not only is it hurting her because it's toxic to breathe, it's ruined her appetite to the point that she can barely bear to eat. The foul taste lingers in her mouth at all times. More work would certainly kill her, so she is left resting at home, and Charlie admires how it does bring the people of Number 5 together, helping to keep her comfortable, though none as devotedly as Tilda, even though it drains nearly all of her already scant savings. Charlie does have the decency to decide, quote, "As there is no time to lose, I must consent to some breach of the unities of my social farce, and bear a hand," end quote. He pretends to have a sudden inheritance from a conveniently dead aunt and claims to take out a loan so he can afford to send Nance out into the country for some fresh air, along with regular medical care, and he'll take Tilda down to see her once a week. When they go, Tilda is pretty in awe of the country. She gets to see wildflowers, which makes her, quote, "childishly happy. The lawless blooms almost scandalize her as creatures that have broken bounds," end quote. She might sell them for a living, but she's rarely had the opportunity to see flowers as they grow. Nance is still weak and doesn't have any appetite, but there's a glow of life to her now that makes Charlie confident that she'll live and recover. On their walk back to the station to go home, they run into 3 hooligans by the roadside, who start mocking them for no reason. At first he and Tilda try to ignore them, until she just can't anymore, so she punches one in the face and knocks him out cold. Charlie drops the second, and the third gives up, at which point Charlie tells Tilda that she's a disappointment. She starts openly weeping about how she's not a good lady, and Charlie's annoyance turns to pity, but he never should have been annoyed in the first place. He's been positively smitten with her ever since he met her, and the first time he saw her, it was seconds after punching a guy in the face. You knew she was like this, Charlie. You even admired it. It never seemed like he thought she needed to change before he started trying to force new hobbies on her. And now he's just being a complete dick for no reason. He does tell her now, well, just make the best of things. Then, if you can't be a lady, just be yourself. And she says, quote, "and have everybody what's better look as if they wouldn't touch me with a pair of tongs. I ain't no good. I stands in the gutter, I do. I can't get out. Give the young'uns a chance in their cradles and let the old 'uns die off. Then you'll see a change," end quote. Charlie doesn't say anything meaningful in response to any of this, just that he wants to hurry to catch the train so he can treat her and Covey to the mogul, which maybe means taking them out for dinner. I guess this is literally seconds after she tells him that him being able to help Nance financially made her feel horribly inadequate. This is not the time to rub it in her face that you can afford to take everyone out for dinner. Cut to a fancy costume party. Charlie wasn't planning to go originally because he'd have to leave John Street, but he's become very intrigued by super-rich Marmaduke Riddler, Seton's father, and all that he represents, and he can't turn down an opportunity to go study him. So he tells everyone he has some family affairs to settle regarding that totally real dead aunt of his, and heads back to the high life for a few days. His return makes him feel more conflicted this time. Last time he left John Street, he was overjoyed, coming off the heels of his brush with starvation. This time he finds himself wondering why he's even here. But the party itself is splendid. We get extensive descriptions of the very fancy costumes everyone is wearing, mostly the rich and powerful of the now, garbed in the splendorous guises of rulers long past. At least 3 different women came as the Queen of Sheba. Charlie is dressed as Piers the Plowman, the titular character of a late 14th century narrative poem that I have not read, but that seems very thematically relevant. We run into Seton Riddler again, and an American who gives everybody shit about not being harsh enough on the poor. Seton's father Marmaduke agrees that the Americans will surpass them eventually because, quote, "We're always trying to pull our millionaires up by the roots. You leave yours to grow," end quote. And then he complains that the Dangerous Trades Committee won't leave him alone to, quote, "carry on his own business in his own way," end quote, by which he means they're trying to impose safety regulations for the sake of the workers, and that's just not fair. While Charlie is watching people glide around the party dance floor, suddenly there appears, quote, "a vision of Nance stretched on her dying bed, with a light in her eyes which is not of this world. It is no vision of fancy, but a sheer objective presence," end quote. He goes straight to number 5, after a costume change, where Covey meets him with bad news. Charlie says he knows Nance is dead, but doesn't explain how or why he knows this. I guess he's psychic now, because he's right. She got a cold that in her weakened state she couldn't fight off, but Covey and Tilda got to be with her out in the country until the end. I actually liked Nance's death scene, but Charlie wasn't there, so I'm not sure why there's a death scene. I think he just concocted a really vivid imagining of what he thinks her death must have been like, which is very in character. Some details he might have been told. Maybe he's been gifted with some author knowledge, but he also gets psychic visions from the beyond now, so who knows? Nance and Tilda both aren't properly religious. They remember some faint teachings from childhood, but, quote, "from the first they had to rough-hew their scheme of a divine government of the world as they went on," end quote. Charlie calls it pure paganism with vaguely Christian traditions. So Nance's deathbed is haunted with faint recollections of what she's heard about God's judgment, the potential threat for eternal torment. She attempts to confess any wrongdoings, confessions that, quote, "soon yielded to the sense that tremendous powers, pitiless, unmoral, working out a law of their own, have us in their grip and will deal with us according to that law. So the engine room of an ocean liner would deal with one who had toppled over into its pulverizing order of wheel and piston working at their full speed," end quote. There is, quote, "the fear that death was going to hurt, now and hereafter. Oh, if only she might really die, really cease to be for good and all, and have done with the miseries of an uncertain event," end quote. She holds on for a moment to the reassurance of her love for Tilda, then, quote, "the sense of the world spinning away from her as the final hour drew nigh. Not she was leaving the world was leaving her, and all its warmth of life and light faded off into the infinite while she shivered alone in the cold and dark. Then, at least, the peace of sheer quiescence without trust. The game was up. Struggle how futile, fear how futile, be still and yield." The grip on Tilda's palm as she balanced on the edge of the green water and saw the boiling foam beyond. Blood trickling from Tilda's palm where the nail had entered the flesh when all was done, end quote. That was grim. I mean, I liked that it was grim, but it was grim. Nance's death shakes up number 5 and really sets Azrael the Anarchist off. He is suggested very briefly to have had a bit of a crush on her, so I'm sure that doesn't help. The amount of absolute burning rage and hatred he is expressing gets unsettling, especially to Tilda. Charlie says he is succumbing to, quote, "the weakest parts of his nature, hate and envy, the craving for revenge. In one word, his sense of the inhumanity of man to man has made him a greater monster than the worst," end quote. Azrael holds a meeting at number 5, right after he's done disrupting Nance's funeral, and it's full of shouting and arguing and utter chaos, and ends very abruptly. The lights go dim, and the crowd is in a rush, and in the chaos, Azrael and Tilda both disappear. Charlie guesses that Azrael might be planning something, and Tilda may have sensed that and gone to stop him, so when he can't find Tilda, he tries to find Azrael. He goes to interrogate Azrael's co-conspirator, Old 48, who claims to not know where he is. Quote, I waste precious time in urging him to amend it by every kind of appeal to his pity and his greed. At length I seize him by the windpipe and choke and beat the truth out of his lying throat. End quote. That was quite suddenly very violent. But it worked, as Rael is headed to a party of Marmaduke Riddlers carrying a bomb. Charlie races there, quote, but before I reach it a loud report rends the air, and I stop at last only to see this. Tilda, stretched dead and warm, and with the martyr's smile on her white face turned to the sky. Beside her, about her, lie the fragments of the murderer, with a rent in his side big enough to sink a ship. The scene tells its own tale. The wretch tried to scale the wall so as to plant his charge against the house. The girl closed with him and dragged him back, but in the struggle the bomb exploded and did its work, alike on the guilty and the innocent. This, then, was the dark decree. Tilda was to die with Nance, both victims, the one to the curse of the disease, the other to the curse of the remedy. End quote. I do have to say, if Tilda was touching Azrael, and he is blasted to smithereens, at least on one side, and the wall he was scaling has a genuine hole through it, Charlie can see through it to a dining room, Tilda cannot have been left in one clean, pretty piece, as implied by the text. We then skip a month ahead into the epilogue. Charlie sits on a hill in the country working on his final report to the governor of the island, and becomes suddenly aware of the presumably metaphorical spiritual presence of the guy who wrote Piers Plowman, that 14th century poem, compelling him to put pen to paper. Plowman covers a lot of similar themes to John Street, it looks like, about the nature of work and corruption of religion and ideals that humans should strive to. I'm sure someone who's actually read it could do a deep thematic analysis of its influence on the ideas presented in John Street, but I am not here to be that smart. I am here to tell Charlie that he's being annoying. Which he is, because under the guidance of this spirit, he dumps on us 5 straight pages of really quite small text. The reports are always in smaller print than the rest of the book, and it is giving me eye strain. He muses about morality and wealth and labor and who is to blame when, quote, Riddler turns Nance's bones into gold, and we quietly pocket it without one single thought of the ethical considerations involved in the reckoning, end quote. He talks about how England should, quote, conquer only to bring the conquered into the family, and to give them their equal place at the board. A board with no boss at the head, but only with a carver whose duty it is to see that all are served. Carnage may be God's daughter, but let her take care to kill for God, end quote. Benevolent colonialism, yay! And a lot of thoughts on religion, which has come up throughout the book, but has not been something that Charlie himself seems to care about much so far. So it's a little weird when he starts going on about how religion is the only way to a successful, just democracy. Without it, it will never succeed. But also, democracy itself must be the religion, the altar on which man sacrifices his natural, self-centered core to birth a better spiritual self, striving for brotherhood, charity, and justice. After 5 pages of this, Charlie is finally able to stop, feeling that the deepest corners of his soul have been robbed of their private thoughts, but he worries this speech might be way too much for the islanders. Quote, but at that moment of crisis, oh, how glad I waked to find this but a dream. End quote. Charlie? Author? You gotta be fucking kidding me. That was 5 dense pages. You don't get to whoopsie, I was dreaming at me, sir. This is probably also a Plowman reference. Most of the contents of that poem takes place in the main character's dreams. That does not make this excusable to me. Instead of his big philosophical speech, Charlie sends the islanders a bunch of pamphlets from the Jubilee celebration and calls it a day. The governor writes him back, addressing all of the various passages Charlie wrote out over the course of his whole experiment, and, the governor has missed every single point that could ever have possibly been made. Charlie told him about over 100,000 poor being fed by charity dinners around the time of the Jubilee, and the governor tells him that he must have miscounted his zeros, or else he doesn't understand the concept of 100,000, because it is impossible for a nation as great and wealthy as England to have that many poor. And people are starving? How could they possibly be starving? People on the island don't starve, and they're so much poorer than England. He also says it sounds like they treat the rich terribly, overworking them so, but he was excited to hear about the concept of trickle-down economics, where a few people have to suck up all the wealth and then rain it back down on everyone else. They tried something similar once on the island, but it didn't really work. The governor just hoarded a bunch of vegetables and then they went bad, while others went hungry, but surely they just did it wrong. If Charlie tells them how to do it right, they'd love to try it. Also, he sent Charlie a sack of yams. The end. We have a novel note review from the June 1899 edition of the Bookman magazine, which says that, quote, Mr. Whiting's method is effective. He draws that netherworld not as it is seen by the naked eye of the reporter, but as it is felt by an artist. He sees shades and tones of things imperceptible to ordinary vision and tinges the whole with his own personality, without destroying the actuality of the impression. He is not an unimpassioned observer, he has taken a side, and is never tired of contrasting the patience, the courage, and self-devotion of the poor with the luxury, the idleness, the fatuity of the rich. In the later chapters, which tell of Nance's illness and death, the genuine pathos is somewhat obscured by a superfluity of reflection. The story is a study in contrasts, but the sudden shifting of the scene from Soho to Golden Mayfair affects us like a brilliant succession of lantern views, rather than a coherent picture of life." End quote. The writer of this one is not credited, from what I can tell. This is by far the most thematic, idea-based novel I've covered so far, and by extension the leanest on plot. Charlie meets some people, they make a speech about their different personal perspectives on life, we walk through some descriptions of their day-to-day existence, there's a lot of pausing for philosophical musing, and then Nance dies, Tilda blows up, the end. And I don't say that critically. I liked the very just this is how people live bits. I liked the language and the style, though more on the second pass through than the first, because it was also a bit hard to parse sometimes. It's not always very clear language, and some sentences were long and winding to the point that they lost me completely until I read them 5 times over. I'm sure it's partially a skill issue on my part. But there were a lot of parts of this script that I had to cut because they didn't matter much, but it was hard because it meant cutting a quote that I really liked. Like, there's a rich lady who lets people host meetings at her house, quote, "if only they have something to say for themselves and do not damage the furniture of the drawing room or the foundations of society," or, quote, "we vaguely aspire to perpetual loafing," or, quote, "the little boys and girls who are beginning to pair according to the laws of the ooze and of the slime," end quote, which is the absolute grossest new way to say the birds and the bees, which I will be using exclusively from now on. Very interestingly, another edition of the Bookman has a small quote from the author himself, where he says that, quote, "I wrote No. 5 John Street to atone to myself, after a fashion, for a lost hope. When, years ago, I returned to my native London after a long residence abroad, it was with a fixed resolve to settle in one of our poorest quarters, and to live its life just to learn how it felt. But circumstances prevented the full realization of the plan," end quote. He saw what he could, whatever that means, and compensated giving up on the full scheme, quote, "by still enjoying it as an imaginative experience on the real basis of my actual studies from life. My hero, at least, could do what I had been balked of doing," end quote, which means that Charlie is to some extent an author surrogate, which makes it even funnier that he is such a bumbling doofus. He is kind of a weird protagonist overall. I think it's intentional. A lot of the time it's part of the joke. Some protagonists are too static. They never change their minds about anything, but Charlie can be so flip-floppy in his opinions, veering from one extreme to the other. He's also kind of very quick to brush past some of the darker elements of life in the slums. Things will bother him, but not too bad. When we're being introduced to life at No. 5, there's a description of young children kept locked inside all day, crawling over each other like caged insects, constantly pressing their dirty hands against the windows as though they were prison bars, wailing hopelessly as they watch other children playing outside. That same chapter, a woman is kicked to death and left on the stairs, and we learn that no one intervened because they assumed it was a matrimonial difference and thus not their business. But Charlie never lingers on these darker elements. He doesn't think about them too hard. They don't feel like they have much of an impact or color his experience of John Street, which those aren't the details the book wants to be about. That's fair. They are acknowledged as realities, and we move on. This isn't a gritty, dark tale of woe. It's a pretty lighthearted satire addressing a grim topic. I don't think we should linger. But it felt kind of weird that Charlie doesn't, as a person, but he's also not a hero in the heroic sense of the word. He's our dumbass fish out of water who occasionally acts like a reasonable human being, which does make it even funnier that he's kind of an author surrogate. Anyway, I think that's enough. So I hope I'll catch you in the next one, and in the meantime you can catch me at YOBPOD, YOBBPOD, on the social media platform of your choice, probably. And for today's life advice from the past, if you're starving, just have some yams.